Cease my babbling and invite a few questions from the audience if anyone would like to follow this up. Anybody have any wild and... Yes?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about men and women, and the degree to which women get associated with vampire myth. During the course of the history you've been sketching out, how often it's associated with women?
That's interesting, actually. I mean, if we go back to the folkloric vampire, and I'll be honest with you, I hadn't occurred to me to actually sort of make that distinction, but going back to the folkloric vampire, sort of let's say, pre-1800, I can't think of an example of a female vampire. There isn't a reason why there shouldn't be. But then once it becomes fictionalized, you tend to get something of a pendulum. So the first forays into vampirism in poetry and so forth in the late 1700s are women. So The Bride of Corinth by Goethe, I think. And then you get some male vampires, and then you get back to the femme fatale. And there's a suggestion that this actually operated in a grander cultural sense, that you had, we've all heard of the femme fatale, but you also had a fatal man, the sort of Byronic anti-hero, and then you got a woman. But yes, I mean, it's curious the way that there does seem to be this seesaw, but also it's very interesting how you mentioned it, but I cannot think of any female vampires pre about 1700.
The Elizabeth Bathory story.
Yeah.
How overstated do you think that is in the development of what we sort of classify as the contemporary vampire?
I imagine the vast majority of you are familiar, but if you're not, Elizabeth Bathory, actually a Transylvanian countess, convicted of the sadistic murder of some 600 primarily serving girls in various different fashions, all of them suggesting some kind of psychosexual component. Everything from stabbing them with pins to red-hot pincers, I seem to recall, leaving them out in the courtyard in the middle of winter and throwing buckets of water on them, that kind of thing. And it's been suggested, one of the myths that grew up around this Transylvanian countess was that her primary motivation was she wanted to bathe in virgin's blood, and that virgin's blood would maintain her youth forever. It has been suggested, I mean, I think most directly in a book called Dracula Was a Woman, that Stoker derived the majority of his inspiration for Dracula from accounts of Countess Bathory. And I think that's been fairly substantially discounted. It's also an area of mass controversy that bubbles along. I think the most recent book was Elizabeth Was Innocent type thing, which is basically... The problem you have is you go back to a certain point in history and you can say, well, they'd never have been convicted under that evidence in a modern court of law, but neither would anybody at that period in history. The idea about how evidence was gathered and so forth is very different. So I think she certainly played a part. She appears that the first major account on Bathory in the English language, I think, was in Sabine Baring-Gould's Book of Werewolves, where he mentions her. And I think it's been established that Bram Stoker had read that while he was researching Dracula. So I think, but the idea that the bathing in blood for immortality, most people now think was a later, folkloric fiction that was added on. So I think it certainly added to the ambience, but I think it has been overstated. I also believe she was guilty of some murders. I don't hold with the idea that she was framed. Anyone else? Yeah.
How do you see the vampire mythology developing in the future?
People have read have written off the vampire numerous times in the past. When I was researching my book, I lost count of the number of magazine articles from the 60s, from the 70s, from the 80s, all saying, of course, the vampire's all worn out and we're not going to see any more vampire films. And of course, they're a hardy perennial. I think that the sort of Twilight tsunami will inevitably, dissipate. I'd like to think we'd get some nasty vampires again. I mean, 30 Days of Night gave us some quite merciless and animalistic creatures. So I think I'd like to see, I mean, it would be interesting if somebody were to try and do a period piece about one of the classic cases from the 1700s. I think you could do something really interesting with that, go back to roots. But who knows? I mean, I think the sort of romantic teen vampires hopefully had its day. Yes?
Thinking about this idea of people coming back from the dead and decomposing in front of your eyes, in the Middle Ages and comparatively recently, there was a lot of leprosy in Britain. Liberton near Edinburgh was originally Lepertown.
Yes,
Has anybody made any sort of connection between groups of people who suffered from leprosy, which tends not to be fatal, but is obviously disfiguring, and the vampire myth?
There have been, I'm trying to think if anyone's actually made a connection with leprosy. I think a connection was made between leprosy and werewolves. But with vampires, I mean, there have been, they're all contemporary theories, let's say contemporary from the sort of 60s, 70s onwards. There was one guy who came forward with this idea that an unpleasant disease called porphyria. So most diseases are unpleasant, I suppose, when you think about it. But a disease called porphyria, which caused you to have an allergy to sunlight and made your gums recede, making your teeth seem bigger. And he's made quite a noise suggesting porphyria explained the vampire myth. And promptly the American Porphyria Society became very irate at the suggestion. Things are tough enough for us already without you. Not to my knowledge. I mean, I suspect, again, we'd go, I mean, and I think there's definitely something to what you say in terms of, you know, the original vampire, you know, would be much closer to a leper or something. But I think the crucial point is here that we've got our three sort of qualifications, and one of them that's central is coming back from the grave. And I mean, one of the main theories is that why vampirism seems to cluster around plague is because times of plague are the point at which people take least care when burying folk. And so you're inevitably going to have a few who are buried before they're actually dead. And this would explain why you'd have bloody fingernails and whatever else, because the poor sod had been trying to claw their way out. So, but yeah, it's an interesting idea, but my suspicion is that, you know, possibly werewolves, possibly something peripheral, but I don't know.